In this mess we're all living through, it's kind of easy to just take every accusation laid against members of the clergy at face value. That is a temptation, and one we must be wary against. Our enemies, both physical and of the spiritual kind, will gladly and gleefully use abuse allegations against members of the clergy to further damage Christ's church. It's an especially strong temptation because so many princes of the church are actively covering for abusers, as the Pennsylvania grand jury report details. Our shepherds are making this temptation so easy to give into that whenever a new case comes to light, it becomes easy to just condemn the accused cleric, regardless of the evidence, or lack thereof, against him. With an increasing number of people openly calling for the abolition of the Catholic Church and making it illegal to be a Catholic, yes, I've seen those calls and they're becoming more common, we must resist this temptation. Remember, those same people who cried Alleluia when our Lord entered Jerusalem were the same who cried for his crucifixion. Our shepherds are supposed to be alter Christus. We must strive to not join the crowd braying for their blood. It's all too easy to do, especially when so many of our shepherds have turned out to be wolves themselves. The case of George Cardinal Pell illustrates what I'm talking about. But first I wanted to thank my patrons for their support of this channel. If you want to join them in supporting my work, there are links in the description below, including links to Patreon and Subscribestar, which is actually now up and running again. Also, I wanted to repeat my call for submissions for the blog, returntotradition.org. There have been a few articles posted by viewers and supporters like you, so please feel free to submit an article for the blog if you want to use the email address in the description below. I can't pay for them at this stage of things, but I do want to help get more Catholic voices out there doing this kind of work for the Church. By now you have to be familiar with the Pell case. The article I'll go over in a moment gives you a brief summation of the story if you're not. In general, it goes like this. Cardinal Pell of Australia was accused of sexually assaulting a pair of teenage altar boys in the sacristy after celebrating Mass. Like, immediately after Mass. In the sacristy. Anyone who has a history of assisting at Mass in the Novus Ordo sense of assisting will find this a weird place to sexually assault someone, which I'll talk about in a moment. Pell was the subject of an investigation in Australia by the Victorian police for several years, possibly as long as 4 years. The media environment towards Pell, especially after his arrest, was not exactly conducive to finding of an impartial jury. This is something to remember in the future as the current phase of the long crisis in the Church continues to unfold. Can a cleric get a fair trial anywhere in the Western world? For my money, the answer to that question is no. It is impossible for a cleric to get a fair trial given the sensational media environment we all suffer under, and given the history of abuse cases and cover-ups by the Catholic hierarchy. This is the inverse of what secular celebrities face in the courtroom. A celebrity will often fare better in court than they might otherwise simply because of name recognition and our culture's idolatrous treatment of entertainers. On the flip side, a Catholic priest of any kind is held in such low regard by the general population that priests are held in immediate suspicion anywhere they go, or at least in many cases. People have, after 20 years of scandals, a socially trained bias against priests. Factor that into the jury selection process and you create a perfect scenario for miscarriage of justice. But let's have a look at the case as it stands. Why the case against Cardinal George Pell doesn't stand up, by George Weigel in National Review. This is a source I don't normally use, and an author I don't particularly care for, but it's a very on-point piece. On appeal, a panel of judges can decide that the verdict could not rationally have been reached on the basis of the evidence. With the lifting of the trial judge's order banning coverage of the conviction of Cardinal George Pell this past December on charges of historical sexual abuse, the facts can finally be laid out for those willing to consider them. Disclosure: Cardinal Pell and the author are longtime friends. Victoria Police commenced an investigation 1 year before any complaints had been filed. During that investigation, the police took out newspaper ads seeking information about any untoward behavior with minors at the St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, without any hint of such misbehavior having been received by the authorities. Once charges had been laid and Cardinal Pell had returned to Australia from his post at the Vatican, a committal hearing to determine whether the charges were capable of being tried was held. The committal hearing judge threw out several charges but allowed others to go forward. Even though she observed that she would not vote to convict on several charges, she thought they should be tried anyway. In Cardinal Pell's first trial, held under the media suppression order, the defense dismantled the prosecution's case while shedding light on the inadequacy of the police investigative process. That trial resulted in a hung jury, which voted 10-2 for acquittal. The foreman and several other members of the jury were in tears when the verdict was read. During the retrial, the defense demonstrated that in order to sustain the charge that Pell had accosted and sexually abused 2 choir boys after Mass on Sunday, 10 improbable things would have had to have happened, and all within 10 minutes. Archbishop Pell would have abandoned his decades-long practice of greeting congregants outside the cathedral after Mass. Pell, who was typically accompanied by a master of ceremonies or sacristan when he was vested for Mass, entered the carefully controlled space of the vesting sacristy alone. The master of ceremonies, charged with helping the archbishop disrobe while removing his own liturgical vestments, had disappeared. The sacristan, charged with the care of the locked sacristy, had also disappeared. The sacristan did not go back and forth between the sacristy and the cathedral sanctuary, removing missals and mass vessels, as was his responsibility and consistent practice. The altar servers, like the sacristan, simply disappeared, rather than helping the sacristan clear the sanctuary by bringing liturgical vessels and books back to the sacristy. The priests who celebrated the Mass with Pell were not in the sacristy disrobing after the ceremony. At least 40 people did not notice that 2 choir boys left the post-Mass procession. 2 choir boys entered the sacristy, started gulping altar wine, and were accosted and abused by Archbishop Pell, while the sacristy door was open and the archbishop was in full liturgical vestments. The abused choir boys then entered the choir room through the locked doors without anyone noticing and participated in a post-Mass rehearsal. No one asked why they had been missing for 10 minutes. Again, as an aside, all of those things would have to have been true for the charges against Pell to stick. Continuing. Before the trial, one of the complainants died, having told his mother that he had never been assaulted. During the trial, there was no corroboration of the surviving complainant's charges. Other choir boys, now of course grown, as well as the choir director and his assistant, the adult members of the choir, the master of ceremonies, and the sacristan all testified. From their testimony, we learned the following: that no one recalled any choir boys bolting from the procession after Mass, that none of those in the immediate vicinity of the alleged abuse noticed anything, that indeed nothing could have happened in a secure space without somebody noticing, and that there was neither gossip nor rumor about any such dramatic and vile incident afterwards. Notwithstanding this evidence of Cardinal Pell's innocence, and innocence affirmed by 10 of the 12 members of the first trial jury, the second trial jury returned a verdict of 12-0 for conviction. Observers at the trial told me that the trial judge seemed surprised on hearing the verdict. The verdict and the finding of the first hung jury suggested that, in the media circus surrounding Pell, a fair jury trial was virtually impossible. That point was recently conceded by the Attorney General of the state of Victoria, who suggested that the law might be amended to permit bench trials by a judge alone in such cases, an option not afforded George Pell. Shortly before the media suppression order was lifted on the 25th of February, the Victorian prosecutors dropped 2 more charges against Cardinal Pell, of even greater dubiety, and dating back some 4 decades. Cardinal Pell's lawyers will, of course, appeal. The appeal will be heard by a panel of senior judges, who can decide what is called in Australia an unsafe verdict, one that the jury could not rationally have reached on the basis of the evidence, was rendered, and that therefore Pell's conviction is null and void. For Cardinal Pell's sake and for the reputation of the justice system in the state of Victoria, one must hope that the appellate judges will do the right thing. Prior to my attending the traditional Latin Mass exclusively, I had been an altar server in the Novus Ordo. I'd even assisted at a Mass for a well-known archbishop, though in the capacity as a lector. In all of those cases, after Mass, there would be reasons to go to the sacristy. Anyone who assisted was required to clean up the sacred vessels in the sacristy, and lectors often helped in other ways. Even in the parishes that offer the traditional Latin Mass, the sacristy is a busy place after Mass. Always, without fail, the sacristy was filled with people, making it more difficult to do the post-Mass duties expected of those serving in the Mass. Always. 100% of the time. I cannot imagine a situation where immediately after Mass, a cardinal archbishop has time without prying eyes about in the sanctuary, at least in the time frame we're talking about here. And that's discounting his long-held practice of meeting people after Mass as they left the parish building. The facts of the case and his history of basic liturgical and pastoral behavior don't add up to the narrative we're being told by the Victorian police. Something to remember that hasn't been widely reported in the Pell case. Prior to the allegations against him being leveled, Cardinal Pell was involved in trying to clean up the mess of the Vatican bank scandals. Sound familiar? Not to ring the bell of the conspiracy theory or whatever, but it is strange that yet another attempt to clean up the Vatican Bank has resulted in the cleric in charge suddenly taken from that investigation, this time in the grips of a vicious sex abuse scandal. It is curious. Keep this in mind as well. Pell was well known for his doctrinal orthodoxy. Pell, he was subjected to for some 25 years to calumnies in both the extremely hostile Australian media as well as in the modernist circles in the church, determined to cash in, shall we say, on the spirit of Vatican II. The Vatican announced last Wednesday that it is opening an investigation into the allegations against Pell, who was for a time the third most powerful man in the Vatican. Pell had been part of Francis's Special Council of Cardinals, the C9, which has since been reduced after the Pope expelled members from his inner circle, Pell among them. Returning to George Weigel's commentary, he points out that Pell should easily win his appeal case and have his conviction overturned. Just going to quote a small part of his report in First Things. Quote, "If it is not reversed on appeal, that false verdict will constitute a new indictment, the indictment of a legal system that could not bring itself to render justice in the face of public hysteria, political vendetta, and media aggression." End quote. Weigel compared the public mood in Australia to that you might find in Salem, Massachusetts during the witchcraft trials of the 17th century. He accuses the Victorian police of conducting a fishing expedition against Pell, at least a year before any complaint had been received from any of the alleged victims. As evidence of this, the chief inspector who had gone after Pell for 4 years, one Detective Chris Reed, sat up front at his trial. His investigation, if you want to call it that, is on trial there as well. But Pell could be found guilty. That's the other problem with this. I'm not surprised by anything anymore in the church when it comes to clerical malfeasance. I definitely am suspicious of the case, given how obviously flawed the facts laid out against him are, and given the scandalous restrictions placed against him in his retrial. But I suppose it could be true. He could have very well abused those boys, though the one who died insisted until his death that nothing had happened, that the charges against Pell were false. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think Pell is innocent? Do you think he's guilty? Are you not sure? Do you think there was a conspiracy against him? I'm interested in seeing your take on the Pell case because our perception of what is really going on in the church right now is too much for any one person to figure out on their own. We're all in this together, which is why I continue to thank you for listening and for your support. And please, going into Lent and beyond, pray and do acts of penance for the liberation and exaltation of the church. This season of penance and mortification can be a very powerful time to do our part for the cleansing of Christ's church. I'm Anthony Stein. Viva Cristo Rey.